Chapter 4, Eyes on the Prize. I took the drastic step of waking up an hour early the next morning to fit in some emergency exercise. Since it was the 30th anniversary of the filming of The Exorcist, I decided to dash over to Prospect and M Street and attempt a workout on the outdoor set of steep stairs that had been famously featured in the movie. I myself had never, and would never, watch The Exorcist because I was an enormous wimp when it came to horror flicks, and my sporadic attempts to toughen up always ended disastrously. When my dorm mates had urged me to watch The Shining in college, I only lasted 15 minutes, and still had to give up my single because I couldn't be alone for the following 3 months. It didn't occur to me until later to wonder whether that had been exactly their plan. But I understood the cultural impact of The Exorcist and felt the anniversary of its filming was worth celebrating. Additionally, running up and down the stairs a few times was hopefully going to make up for weeks of less than healthy living and whip me instantly into shape. 75 stairs was a lot of stairs. For some demonic reason, I spent the entire sweaty time reviewing my previous relationships in my head. This was rarely a good idea. There hadn't been that many serious ones, only 3 that lasted more than a few months. And though I didn't regret any of them being over, there were still plenty of unresolved issues to obsess about, as well as many cringeworthy moments. I spent the entirety of my second stair set painfully remembering my phone-stalking pursuit of Jason Chambers, a good-looking consultant my mother's friend had set me up with when I first moved to D.C. We'd had a charming lunch filled with promising chemistry and agreed to get together for a movie that weekend. I couldn't believe my luck. Brand new to D.C. and not knowing a soul, I already had a date with an extremely attractive native. He said he'd call on Saturday morning. He never did. By 6 o'clock that evening, I decided the only reasonable course of action was to begin calling him repeatedly and hanging up when it went to voicemail. When he finally called at 10 o'clock the next morning, he said he had 62 calls from my number on his caller ID, but no messages, and was everything all right? No, it clearly wasn't. I feigned total surprise and spent an agonizing minute wondering aloud what could possibly account for such a weird thing. Maybe a cross-wire glitch was somehow to blame? I said I had rung him once before going out, just to check on the movie status, but certainly not more than once. Definitely nowhere close to 62 times. Gosh, he must have thought I was insane. But now he knew that it was the phone service that was the nutty one, and, wow, look at the time I really had to run. He politely played along, and we agreed to reschedule for later, but he left it to me to call him, and I was too suffocated by shame to even consider trying to rekindle his interest. Why hadn't I realized the sudden ubiquity of caller IDs? That was a question I punished myself with during times such as these. I had tried hard to erase the whole incident from my mind. Unfortunately, his phone number, which I had of course memorized during the course of that fateful evening, had the troubling distinction of sharing the first 3 digits with Liza's home number, so I lived in fear of accidentally calling him and prompting him to reconsider that restraining order. Revisiting this embarrassing episode, along with the litany of other dating gaps and romantic missteps I tortuously reviewed as I puffed up the stairs, just caused them all to burn even darker and stronger in my memory. I realized suddenly as I finally finished the grueling 4th set that, along with my legs, I'd spent the last half hour exercising my demons. This struck me as particularly counterproductive and homophonically ironic given the location. I made my gasping way home, feeling like I might have missed an opportunity. At the office, 3 coffees later, I decided that the past, no matter how unchangeably brutal, was prologue to the dreamlike relationship I was about to embark upon with Aaron. I was tougher and wiser because of my mistakes and would obviously never repeat them. And I was a different person in other ways, more confident, secure, and settled. Not objectively per se, but relatively to when I had first moved to Washington, at least. Partly due to my new attitude, partly due to excessive level of caffeine coursing through my bloodstream, I had an amazingly productive day. I spent most of it laying the groundwork for the series of open meetings RG was planning to host across Ohio during the Senate summer recess at the end of August. Open meetings were large scheduled gatherings that served as forums for dialogue between RG and his constituents. Anyone could come to ask questions or air concerns, and RG would stand there for hours, ensuring that everyone had their chance at FaceTime. I loved open meetings, and not only because RG was particularly good at them. I thought of them as festivals of accountability and communication, parentheses, though granted they could sometimes be tedious and boring, close parentheses. And given that they encapsulated the basic relationship at the heart of representative democracy, the one between the electee and the electors, it shocked me that more senators didn't initiate them. RG wanted the August round of open meetings to center mainly on healthcare concerns, so I was to be his traveling staff on the trip. I obviously wanted everything to go as smoothly as possible, and was deep in planning mode. There were sites to pick, vehicles to rent, awareness to raise, bills to succinctly summarize into plain language, and multiple other tasks to keep me busy. Wednesday passed in a similarly hectic haze, and Thursday arrived before I knew it. I woke up abruptly thanks to a 5:30 a.m. phone call from my mom, who wanted to make sure everything was okay, as she had just woken up from a dream that I had been crushed by a giant paperclip. My mom wasn't one to put a lot of stock in dreams, so I was a bit surprised by her call. As she described how the paperclip had just fallen out of a pre-dawn sky, I could hear Yellow Submarine playing in the background, and I wondered if she had the CD on repeat, as usual. My mom had been both a political science major and a UK rock groupie at Berkeley in the 60s. She'd welcomed the British invasion with open and eager arms, and had fallen particularly hard for all things Beatles, Rolling Stones, and The Who, to name a few. In her opinion, the music that had come out of the United Kingdom had been far superior to anything the States had shown for themselves. In her early 20s, she'd organized fan clubs, convinced my dad to grow out his hair, and spoken with a British tinge to her Midwestern accent. After completing graduate school, she had turned down a job at Stanford to live in Ohio with my father, who had committed himself to modernizing the dairy farm that had been in his family for generations. Amidst the hubbub of this transformed and thriving operation, my mother had raised me to pay close attention to the world of public service, while she herself had happily taught at the local community college. And every once in a while, she did things to remind me that in addition to being a political science professor, she was also a recovering Anglophile, like watching BBC America for hours on end, or saying someone was pissed to communicate that they were drunk rather than angry, although occasionally both applied. When she finished the tale of her disturbing dream, I assured her I was unmushed, promised I'd call later, and decided to use the unexpected extra hour to make myself as irresistible as possible, since I was fairly sure I'd have to meet Aaron straight from work. When I closed my eyes in the shower, I too had an image of me being crushed by a giant paperclip. Thank you, Mom. I was mildly concerned by the possibility that she'd experienced a legitimate maternal premonition about my imminent doom via oversized office supplies, and resolved to be extra alert that day. I was disgruntled to discover, upon critical examination in my bathroom mirror, that I had not pulled off the supermodel transformation as scheduled. I told myself it didn't look bad, though. Plus, as every falsely modest model on the planet infuriatingly said, beauty came from within. Luckily, there was still time to achieve spiritual peace and wholeness via intense meditation before I had to catch my train to work. Daily meditation had been one of my Chinese New Year's resolutions, though I'd only managed to honor the daily part of it for the first week. I didn't mind sitting still for 30 minutes. Quite to the contrary, I was thrilled to have spiritual sanctioned laziness be a regular part of my day. But I did find it very difficult to clear my mind of all thoughts. Even if my only thought was, come on, it can't be this hard not to think about anything, I had failed. It had been 3 weeks since my last meditation. I confessed to the little wood-carved Buddha I placed next to me for inspiration. His chubby oaken face gleamed forgivingly. I closed my eyes and began flicking away my thoughts, eager for the serenity of spiritual enlightenment. An hour and 15 minutes later, I awoke with a start, jolted by the earthquake rumble of the garbage truck lumbering down my street. I wiped the drool from my mouth and looked around, disoriented. The clock grinned devilishly back at me. It had got to be kidding. In what felt like the blink of a mantra, my time surplus had turned into a deficit, and I now had only 7 minutes to get to work. So much for inner peace. I arrived frazzled and sweating, and couldn't shake a manic rush feeling for most of the morning. I'd taken the elevator up with Mark Herbert, who'd looked panicked to find himself in an enclosed space with me. He'd stared at his feet the whole time, and, feeling too stressed to combat the awkward silence, I had pretended to be crucially involved with my BlackBerry. A fresh printout of the hotline greeted me at my desk. I scanned the compilation of headlines, large and small, pausing to absorb any buzzworthy quotes from lawmakers and journalists. Along with the note, a daily summary of political news available on abcnews.com. The hotline was the page 6 of Capitol Hill. It was difficult not to skip straight to the comedy section that included the best political jokes by Jon Stewart, Conan, Letterman, and Leno from the night before. But I patiently skimmed the entries in order, alternately pleased and outraged by the news it delivered. Congressman Harris had apparently compared homosexuality to his wife's compulsive shopping disorder, a, quote, terrible disease that must be fought with firm compassion. Quote, brilliant. So glad such intelligent, progressive leaders were shaping national policy. Laura Harris had bought more than $400,000 worth of designer clothing from various D.C. department stores in the 6 months they lived in the district. After her third credit card was denied, a gossipy sales clerk had called the Washington Post. The ensuing brouhaha didn't sit well in Harris's New Mexico district. It certainly didn't help that New Mexico is one of the poorest states in the Union and had particularly suffered during the last 6 years of national recession. Angry constituents and newspaper editors had been demanding an explanation. At first, the congressman had responded with a joke about how hard it was to rein the little lady in when she always looked so pretty, but to his surprise, this hadn't quieted his critics. He'd subsequently gotten misty-eyed with Diane Sawyer over his wife's problem, and now the Congress seemed to be trotting out a "love me, I'm a homophobe" plea to win back the approval of his base. Since Congressman Harris had been one of the leading fundraisers for the president's re-elect the last time around, I tried to prepare myself for the inevitable statement from President Pyle about how he could, quote, look Jeb Harris dead in the eye and tell he was a good man, unquote. But could anyone ever really be prepared for such inanity? As presidents went, Pyle had been a disaster. His administration had made a tremendous mess of things over the last 7 years, and by practically all accounts, its reign had proved an unmitigated catastrophe. Their economic, social, and environmental policies, or more accurately, lack thereof, had plunged the nation into a brutal recession and set America back a decade or more. The international community had become accustomed to shaking its head at America's troubles and did its best to prevent the Pyle administration from spreading its unique brand of arrogant ineptitude beyond American borders. It was a sad state of affairs. Even Pyle's own party had a sense of how bad things had gotten, and most of them were falling all over themselves to distance themselves from the administration. The vice president, Dan Linke, wasn't even attempting a campaign. Tarred by multiple scandals, he was going to be busy enough avoiding indictment. The only good thing about how terrible the Pyle years had been was the fact that the country was desperate for new leadership to clean up the wreckage. With that in mind, I spent a few minutes absorbing the latest stories on the nascent presidential campaign. 15 months away, it was already commanding a substantial section in the news summaries. Besides Bremen, there were 6 other candidates from his party vying for the nomination. Yet, so far, only 2 of them appeared poised to give him a run for his money. Melanie Spearham was a senator from Illinois and the only woman making the race thus far. She intrigued me with her icy professionalism and dogged ambition, and I wondered if she could go all the way. I'd never interacted with her in person, but continued to watch her from an interested distance. According to the hotline, she was posting strong numbers in New Hampshire and appeared to be receiving a substantial amount of press attention. Though I was thrilled by the idea of a female nominee, I felt more drawn to Wilson Rexford, the other leading contender in the top 3. Rexford was a 37-year-old congressman from Seattle and the youngest person running. In my opinion, he emanated a brand of passionate exuberance that I hadn't yet identified in any of the other candidates. Rexford was the son of a beloved governor who died at a young age, and he seemed to feel like he didn't have any time to lose. Indeed, he conducted himself like a man ready to pull out all the stops to make his mark, including summoning up blistering rhetoric his more staid competitors shied away from. I always enjoyed reading about him and suspected he was capable of big things. Liza interrupted the campaign update by calling to vent about a coworker who noisily cracked his joints. "No, you're not being unreasonable. It is gross," I commiserated. "Have you said anything to him?" She hadn't. Though worse is the thing he does with his neck. He warms up to it by doing all his knuckles in order, followed by his ankles. Then he rolls his head around and unleashes this disgusting finale of crackling pops. Okay, stop. You're making me nauseous. I know, it's sickening. I can hear these little gurgles, like his veins are being squelched or something. And Liza, I'm serious. Oh, right, sorry. It was too late. My limbs had gone weak. For a healthcare analyst obsessed with obscure diseases, I had a remarkably low tolerance for any discussion of necks, wrists, or Achilles' heels. It was an odd, phobic trifecta I tried to avoid divulging to anyone but close friends. My psych major college roommate had said it was fairly normal for people to feel skittish about these body parts because they were human beings' most vulnerable points, but I'd never met anyone who seemed as bothered by them as I was. Once I'd been forced to think about any of the 3 in a concentrated way, I pretty much had to take a 5-minute time out to recover. And if confronted by any visual depiction of harm to these areas, the damage could be much more severe. There were a remarkable number of movies that featured suicide via violence to the wrist area, and more than once I'd had to be helped out of theaters and given paper bags to breathe into. In short, Liza should have known better. "Can you move your arms yet?" she asked guiltily. "I'll be okay," I whispered bravely. I was still feeling a bit limp 10 minutes later when I had to brief RG on a conference call that afternoon with a group of hospital administrators. He looked wan and stressed again, though he seemed to be absorbing all the background I was downloading. He fiddled with his watch as I wrapped up. "Okay, sounds good. Are you setting up the call?" he asked. "Yes, sir, and I'll just stay on and follow up afterwards." He nodded and fought back a yawn. I wondered how much sleep he got in the night before. Perhaps he'd benefit from a little meditation. RG checked his watch a final time and brightened suddenly. "Jenny and the boys are stopping by in a few hours on their way back from the museum," he told me, for no apparent reason other than the fact that he seemed excited about it. That was another thing I liked about RG. He had a very pure, boyish quality about him when he was happy, and his wife and children seemed to make him happier than anything else could. I'd always found this refreshing, particularly in an environment where too many people seemed to treat their family members as necessary props to be occasionally trotted out, yet avoided the majority of the time. "That's great. I'd love to see them. The boys must be getting big." It felt odd talking to RG about anything besides work, especially in such an informal, friendly way. Though I was only reciprocating his tone, I worried it was still somehow insubordinate. But I was curious to see the boys. Jack and Jeffrey Gary had been born the same week I'd begun work in RG's DC office. Accordingly, there was a part of me that felt that my professional arc was somehow developmentally tied to their progress. We were certainly both associated with the same senator. I stopped musing about how the twins and I had both been cutting out teeth in different ways over the past few months and tuned back in with the uncomfortable feeling RG had just said something I hadn't registered. "Pardon me, sir?" I asked, he enunciated tersely. "What you're still doing here? Aren't we done?" "Okay, friendly time over." I scurried back to my desk to begin setting up the conference call, but was delayed by the arrival of an email from Aaron. To Samantha Joyce, srjoyce@gary.senate.gov. From Aaron Driver, AI driver at bremen.senate.gov. Subject, best date ever. Text, Sammy, we still on for tonight? Don't torture me, say yes. How about meeting at the Oval Room, parentheses bar, not actual, unless you can arrange entrance, in which case let's go crazy, close parentheses. Around 8? I figured we could throw some beer on some people before grabbing a bite to eat somewhere. Let me know. Once again I hesitated for a moment. It would be so easy to get out of this, but I knew I didn't want to. To Aaron Driver, AI driver at bremen.senate.gov. From Samantha Joyce, srjoyce@gary.senate.gov. Subject, best date ever. Text, I'll see you there at 8. I'll be the lady needing to be rescued from the angry mob. I found it slightly more difficult than usual to concentrate on the work at hand, but managed to set up the conference call without a hitch. A few hours later, I was passing by RG's office on my way to the hall when I heard the sound of babies giggling. Apparently, Jenny and the twins had arrived. Samantha, come in here and settle this, would you? RG called out to me. Settle what? Did I have to take sides? Choose between my boss and his wife? This seemed like a lose-lose situation. Absolutely, sir, I chimed. When I walked in the office, Jack and Jeffrey were crawling around on the couch. What do you need, sir? I asked, professionally hiding the fear in my voice. Jenny and I have tiebreaker shots to make, but the twins just woke up. Do you mind watching them for just a second? Jenny was holding RG's Nerf basketball in her hand. The hoop hung on the private restroom door behind them. It wasn't normally there. RG only brought it out for special occasions. Jenny looked reproachfully at RG. She was 41 and softly pretty, and she carried her gently curvy 5'4" frame with a directness that hinted at her sharply active mind. I still didn't know her well, but I'd heard bits and pieces about her from other people in the office. Apparently, she and RG had been grad school sweethearts, and as her husband had worked his way through Congress, she had worked part-time while desperately trying to conceive. It had taken over a decade and lots of fertility treatments, but she'd finally become pregnant. Since the twins' birth a year ago, she had devoted herself to motherhood, and beneath the fatigue, she glowed like she'd won the lottery. However, at this exact moment, she looked disapproving. "Robert, you can't ask her to do that," she said. RG turned back towards me. "Look, I know it's illegal to ask you to do this in the capacity of being my employee, so will you do it just as a friend? Leave 10 minutes earlier or something to even everything out?" "Of course, shoot away," I answered. Jack and Jeffrey were stereotypically adorable, all dimples and huge blue eyes. They peered out eagerly from the cave of couch pillows that had cushioned their nap, taking in as many of the sights and sounds as they could gather. I stared back at them, marveling anew at how completely identical they were. In fact, the only way to tell them apart was their different colored overalls. Jack was in blue, Jeffrey green. Or was it the other way around? The one wearing green began to cry. The Garys immediately looked over. "Everything's okay," I said confidently, as I began to bounce him gently on my knee. "It's all right, Jeffrey," Jenny called soothingly before returning to their game. Jeffrey's identity confirmed, I clucked maternally at him as I bounced. Jack stopped his crawling to stare at me. His expression seemed to convey that he hadn't realized I could make such noises. I was accustomed to being underestimated. Slowly, Jeffrey stopped crying. I varied my clucks with some oinks and moos to keep Jack's interest. I was all of a sudden reminded of a loathsome article in one of those magazines that focus exclusively on how to keep a man interested in one's bikini-ready body. The article had suggested trying new things in bed, like role-playing. It read, "Even if you're not one for bestiality, pretending to be a barnyard animal can really turn a guy on." Even if you're not one for bestiality, the phrasing suggested that being for or against bestiality was a casual decision that could go either way. I had picked up the magazine in the interest of getting rock-hard buns in 10 minutes or less, and here I'd been confronted with an implicit acceptance of sex with animals. I'd been alarmed at the time and was distressed to recall it now, especially with 2-year-olds watching me intensely. I hoped the memory of that horrid article wasn't projecting out of me and smutting up their auras. Didn't seem to be. They were both grinning at me happily. They really were amazing. As I gazed maternally back at them, I felt an unfamiliar warm feeling. It took a moment to realize the source. Jeffrey was joyfully pissing through his diaper onto my suede skirt. Staying calm was my second instinct. By the time I had determined that was the best course of action, I couldn't retract my first one, which was to shriek in damaged suede alarm. The Garys sprinted over and snatched the boys up, asking me worriedly what was wrong with them, what had happened. I quickly assured them everything was fine, pointed out the urine development, and apologized for overreacting. "Oh gosh, suede," Mrs. Gary said sympathetically. "Is that bad?" RG asked. I guess fabric trivia wasn't included in the long list of things RG knew everything about. To be honest, it barely deserved to be on the list of things I knew vaguely about. When my mom had given me the suede skirt for my birthday, a surprisingly hip present from her, she'd mentioned that spilling liquid on it was a bad idea and had made me promise not to wear it in the rain. Her pointed tone suggested that she believed if she didn't say anything, I would rush to change into the skirt at the first sign of a thunderstorm. I had worn it for my date with Aaron because I thought it made me look more stylish than I actually was. "I'm so sorry, Samantha. We'll pay for it to get dry cleaned, of course," Jenny Gary was saying to me. Was there a 1-hour dry cleaner nearby that wouldn't mind me waiting on premises in my underwear? If there was, it probably wasn't an establishment that'd be a good idea to frequent. "Oh, no, don't worry about it. No problem at all," I insisted as I made my way towards the door. I fended off a few more apologies and escaped to the restroom, where I transformed the medium-sized urine stain into a giant-sized water one before returning to my desk in defeat. I was supposed to meet Aaron in 45 minutes, and I still had a long call list to return, plus a briefing on the National Institutes of Health's new study findings to write. On top of it all, I was sick of panicking, at least for the moment. There wasn't time to race home to change, and my only other option was the gym clothes I kept optimistically and fruitlessly packed in a bag under my desk. So he was either going to go for me, stained skirt and all, or it was his loss. As I made my way to the Oval Room 40 minutes later, I pondered whether my newfound calm was the response of a recently contracted mind-altering disease. Could I have somehow become infected with meningitis of the brain? Now that I thought about it, my neck was stiff and my head was throbbing a bit. If my fears were founded, there really wasn't much I could do beyond deciding to make one of my last nights alive a memorable one. This decision led me to my shot of tequila while I waited for Aaron, just a little waker-upper to get me going, followed immediately by a breath mint to protect my reputation. Aaron arrived 15 minutes late, but with a flower Pez dispenser. Flower and candy in one. Strong move. I pointed out my skirt stain immediately to assure him that I was well aware of its presence. He laughed at the story, which made the whole peeing episode seem infinitely worthwhile. Aaron steered me towards a little table against the wall and ordered some wine. As I sat across from him, I felt hot and tongue-tied, as familiar waves of panic flooded my nervous system. Clearly, the newfound calm had fled. At least that meant the meningitis scare was over. He asked me my impression of D.C. and how I'd enjoyed my time here. He asked about my family and life in Ohio, but he mainly talked and I gladly listened. He was fascinating to absorb, all dazzling eloquence. He was 29 and had grown up in the Florida Panhandle, but both his parents were from Alabama, which helped explain the accent. He'd gone to Tulane Law School, but decided not to be a lawyer. If he were someone else, this would have struck me as a waste of time, but with him it seemed a mark of character. He'd always wanted to be an English teacher, but had sort of fallen into speech writing through a law review connection. He made his life sound full and inviting and ripe for sharing, and he had an intense, burning way about him that made me want to intrigue him. After our second glass of wine, he took my hand, and I felt my heart drop a little nod of acknowledgement. "How does Chinese sound to you?" he asked intimately. I longed to answer him in fluent Mandarin, but could only manage an unimpressive nod. He put his hand on the small of my back as we made our way out of the bar. I felt guided, if not quite safe, and I wanted more of him touching me. Over Mushu pork and Kung Pao chicken, we talked about our jobs. Not the boring details, but the distinctive experiences that periodically reminded us that we were part of a unique world. I decided he needed to be more thoroughly vetted before I could tell him about the Alfred Jackman incident, but I did talk about some other senior citizen constituents who kept me motivated, ones who hadn't been responsible for my being in possession of a felonious amount of marijuana less than a week ago. I told him about Flora Henderson, a 76-year-old widowed grandmother who'd called the office the other day to get advice on how to choose between two medications. She needed both but could only afford one, and her doctors refused to advise her. She had voted for Senator Gary and thought he was, quote, a very smart man who really cares about people, unquote. So she wondered if she could get his advice. I ended up talking to her for 45 minutes and did my best to help her. After I got off the phone, Flora's voice and dilemma stayed in my head, and I ended up working even later than usual that night to research the bill that would hopefully bring her relief. Aaron stared at me for a long, neck-rash-flaring moment when I finished my Flora story. "You're different," he said simply. Different good or different euphemism for weirdo? I couldn't tell from his distant, musing expression. What thought was he staring at from the inside of his head? In an instant he was back, focusing all of his smoldering attention on my face. "You really mean what you say, and you hold on to what's pure about this business. Most girls around here are jaded or defeated, but you've got a spark," he finished. I felt flattered and embarrassed. "Oh, just give me a little time," I said airily. "No, I'm serious. You literally got pissed on today, and yet you exude this sense of not being able to wait to get back to work. That's different, believe me." Had I really managed to intrigue him? Thank you, Flora. I smiled demurely and sipped my wine. "Well, I don't want to get you too worried that I'd rather be someplace else right now," I smiled at him. "Work's great, but this is almost as good." Aaron laughed engagingly. "I'm happy if I'm pulling a close second," he said. "I'll try my best to edge past by the end of the night." I was just imagining that he wouldn't have too much trouble when I remembered that I'd planned on being sensible. I couldn't get carried away. There was still too much I didn't know about Aaron. "So how is working for Brayman anyway?" I asked, hoping his answer would either reveal that Aaron was aware that his boss wasn't the best person, or that he'd been working for him for too short a time to really know. "It's great," Aaron replied. Not the reply I'd been hoping for. "He has a reputation for being a bit self-absorbed," I said carefully. "Do you find that to be the case?" Aaron laughed. "Do they let you in the Senate if you're not?" he asked with a grin. "Well, yes, actually." I was happy to submit evidence, but Aaron kept talking. "Look, Brayman's an ambitious guy," he continued. "He does what it takes to get ahead, and I can relate to that. I mean, I'm not devoted to him or anything. I'd leave in a second for a better job, but it doesn't get much better than writing speeches for the future president." I stared at him for a moment. Which part of his answer should I object to first? I had intended to stay positive for the sake of the children we might still someday have, but I felt myself growing argumentative. "Brayman doesn't necessarily have the nomination sealed up," I pointed out. "Any of the others could still get it." Aaron shook his head. "Spurum and Rexford might prove a little tough, but the other three aren't going anywhere," he said confidently. The other three were Ellis Conrad, Hank Candle, and Max Y., all of whom still had plenty of time to catch fire, in my opinion. Conrad was a 4-term senator from Michigan and the only African-American candidate for the presidency. I found him articulate and persuasive, and I noticed that his colleagues in the Senate always listened closely when he spoke. Hank Candle was a less compelling speaker, but a congressman from Rhode Island of unassailable integrity, consistently leading the charge on ethics investigations and championing a legislative commitment to human rights. In photos, he looked to me like the head Keebler elf, though I doubted this was the image he was shooting for. And Max Y was the governor of Louisiana and the sole candidate from beyond the Beltway. Though some raved about Y's intelligence and uncanny ability to connect with people, he had been unable to capture the attention of the National Press Corps thus far. As a result, I still didn't know all that much about him, but I wouldn't write any of them off this early in the process. You really don't think they have a chance? I challenged. Aaron shrugged. None of them will be able to raise the cash, she said simply. He seemed so sure of himself and of the world of politics. Had Brayman's self-importance rubbed off on him, or was he already conceited all on his own? Either way, I suddenly had an urge to rattle him. I don't like Brayman, I announced. I normally didn't announce my dislike for people until I'd at least met them, and then usually not to anyone who worked directly for them, but I was being shocking. Yeah, I picked up on that, Aaron replied. Why not? I think he's arrogant and slimy, and much more worried about his own political career than with really helping people. So there. I hoped Aaron was appropriately shaken. He looked instead like he was trying not to smile. What? What's so funny? He put his hand over mine. You're so fiery and idealistic, he said, and so new to DC. Are you saying I'm naive? I interrupted him. I hated it when people called me naive. No, not naive, Aaron replied, just young, in a good way, and beautiful. He stared into my eyes. To my annoyance, I momentarily forgot the biting retorts I'd been planning. Damn it, I tried hard to remember them. I understand if you don't like Brayman, he said softly, but can we be adults and agree to disagree? Because I do really like you. I kept my mouth shut for a few moments. Aaron still had his hand over mine, and I could feel my neck rash burning underneath the tight sleeveless turtleneck I'd worn for cover. Like it or not, I was attracted to him. Maybe I should drop the argument for the moment. Okay, I said finally. To being adults, I raised my glass. As long as it's fun, Aaron clarified with a smile. As long as it's fun. We drank some more wine and covered safer topics until we made it solidly back to flirtatious ground. Aaron really was being very charming. Maybe I'd been too uptight about the whole Brayman thing. Did it really matter that much? When the check arrived, we cracked open our cookies and read our fortunes aloud. Mine assured me good luck was coming my way. I criticized it as vague and generic, but secretly took it as an excellent sign for the prognosis of our relationship. Aaron's fortune stated that he was extraordinarily good with his hands, though I normally hated it when fortune cookies tended towards descriptions rather than prediction. I didn't have as much of a problem with this one. Aaron held up his hands for my perusal. What do you think? Instruments of genius, he asked. Absolutely, I nodded supportively. He pondered. Well, I haven't done anything spectacular yet, but maybe they're just waiting for the right muse, he said, suggestively, as he smoothed my hair away from my eyes, letting his hand linger on my cheek. Maybe it was the 3 drinks I consumed, maybe it was the MSG, but I felt like I was falling in love. As we walked out of the restaurant and into the muggy night, he slid his arm around my shoulders. Have you ever been to the monuments at night, he asked. I hadn't. It hadn't ever occurred to me that it would be a fun or safe thing to do. But all of a sudden, it seemed like a fantastic plan. Is it my lucky night? I asked, sincerely hoping it was. Well, there's actually a tower being built down the block from my apartment, and if you squint at it from my balcony, it looks a lot like the Washington Monument, he offered. I think I should be the judge of that, I said. and we were off. Back at the apartment, Aaron shared with his friend Mike, who was thankfully out of town. We opened a bottle of champagne and surveyed the view from his balcony. To be honest, I'm getting more of an Eiffel Tower feel, I said, with severely squinted eyes. He answered me by saying something in French, which I couldn't understand, but found extremely sexy. I had a lot of trouble with languages. Even the foreign words that had been completely assimilated into the English language I felt insecure about. For example, I couldn't say croissant the way it was supposed to be said, and tended to stumble and mumble over the word. Phrases like joie de vivre and pied-à-terre I avoided wholesale. Pardon, I asked, using the flat American pronunciation. I suggested that if you close your eyes completely, you can call it whatever you like. I obliged and was coming up with something my champagne-saturated brain considered very witty to say, when I felt his warm lips on mine. I found in my previous experience that it was relatively difficult to have a good first kiss. This was a really good first kiss. All thoughts flew away, followed quickly by several articles of clothing. We made our clawing way back inside to his couch, where I spilled the rest of the champagne on my skirt. I guess I just wasn't meant to wear the skirt today, I managed breathlessly, as Aaron freed me from my bra. I couldn't agree more, he answered, his hand moving down my back. Let's get you out of it right away. Yes, let's.